Howdy there, this is Keith Harmony from Kansas State University, and I'm here today to talk to you about grazing management. And grazing management is really a combination of art and science, where we try to balance the forage, animal, human, and capital resources to reach some sort of grazing objective in a pasture. And that grazing objective is usually one that includes optimal animal production. We're also trying to either maintain or improve our pasture resource. The main basic way that we're able to achieve that balance between all those factors is through a stocking rate. A stocking rate is a set number of animals on a set area for a set period of time. And we use that stocking rate to balance the amount of forage that's produced on an area with the amount of forage demand that animals are going to have while they're grazing. So what is a stocking rate that lets us balance the amount of forage demand and the amount of forage that's available from what the pasture is producing? Typically, in a common grazing situation, we're usually shooting for a level in where half of the forage that's produced during a season actually remains as leaf material and as standing residue out in a pasture at the end of the year. That means that half of the forage that's produced during the year disappears in some form or manner. Out of that portion that disappears, half of that usually ends up as intake into the animal. And the other half is forage that's either trampled on by the grazing animals, it's utilized by grazing and browsing wildlife, or it's utilized by insects such as grasshoppers and caterpillars and other insects that are going to be foraging on those leaves of that grass and forage material that's out in pasture. So we're usually shooting for a 50% removal by the end of the grazing season. And thus, oftentimes folks refer to that as a take half and leave half scenario. So the 50% that's removed during the season, half of that ends up as animal intake. The amount of forage that those animals graze and actually consume during the season compared to how much forage is actually produced in the pasture during the whole year is called the harvest efficiency. And in a common scenario where we have take half and leave half, that harvest efficiency typically is about 25%. And that efficiency can increase if some sort of a rotational grazing system is used. And that typically occurs because we have more leaf material being consumed and less falling away as weathered material that may be sloughing off of plants from weather or from the trampling that animals may do in a pasture during the year. A rotational stocking system is one in which several pastures are included in a system and they are grazed only for short periods of time during the grazing season. This allows some pastures to be deferred where they're not grazed until the later part of the season, or they receive some sort of rest during the year, thus allowing them to put on more leaf material to photosynthesize and produce carbohydrates, and overall to put more energy back into the plant system so that they're able to produce more leaves, more buds, and have energy for making it through the winter dormant season. The other form of stocking system that's commonly used is some form of a continuous stocking system. A continuous stocking system is one in which animals are placed in a pasture through the whole grazing system. And those animals are able to basically have free access throughout the whole pasture to choose and select the plants and parts of plants that they want to graze, oftentimes choosing a very high quality diet. The stocking system that's used, whether it's a form of a continuous system or whether it's a form of rotational system, either system can be used under good grazing management. The main factor in being able to balance the amount of forage that's produced with the amount of forage demand is making sure that we have measurements of how much that pasture is going to be able to produce, and we have an estimate of how much forage intake those animals are going to have throughout the year. For tall grass pastures, we're usually looking for 6 to 8 inches of growth left at the end of the growing season. For mixed grass pastures, 4 to 6 inches. And for short grass pastures, we're looking for 2 to 4 inches of growth. Maintaining those levels of growth at the end of the year is going to allow those pastures to capture snowfall during the dormant season, to have some insulative cover throughout the dormant season, and also they're going to be able to capture rainfall that occurs early the next growing season so that we get water to infiltrate into the soil, so it's going to be available for those plants to grow vigorously again the next spring. Finding that balance in a stocking rate can be achieved whether or not a continuous or a rotational system is used in a pasture. The key factor is having a moderate stocking rate that you're able to achieve that balance between intake and what's available. Within any stocking system, the amount of vegetative growth that we see above ground is going to be reflected in the amount of vegetative growth that we see below ground. 1/2 to 2/3 of all the growth that we have in plants, all the dry matter that's been accumulated, actually occurs below the soil surface. So in pastures that have been excessively foliated repeatedly throughout a season, have very little leaf growth and very little above ground plant growth. Well, those plants need those leaves in order to produce carbohydrate in order to shift that carbohydrate down into the root system for more root growth. So if we don't have above ground growth, we also lack the carbohydrate and energy needed for more root growth. Without an extensive volume of roots, we have fewer roots in order to explore the soil volume for nutrient uptake and for capturing soil moisture. So in essence, in excessively grazed pastures, we can actually create our own drought situation. We don't have enough vegetation above the soil surface to capture rainfall, to keep it on the landscape and allow it to infiltrate into the soil. And we don't have as many roots below ground in order to explore the soil volume to extract soil moisture that does make it below the soil surface. The more growth we have above ground, the more extensive root system we have below ground. The main thing that a stocking system allows a producer or a land manager to do is to change or alter or to have management over the time, the amount, and the intensity of grazing that takes place within each grazing event. The stocking system that's used basically allows us to choose when and where the defoliation is going to occur, what parts of the pasture and when during the year those animals are going to graze, and how much forage is going to be removed within any grazing event. So once a stocking rate's been chosen for a pasture or set of pastures and animals have been stocked in the spring, one thing that land managers need to keep in mind is the amount of precipitation that we receive in April, May, and June. The amount of precip that we receive during that late spring, early summer time period has a great effect on how much forage production those pastures are going to have throughout the rest of the growing season. More than half of the forage growth is going to occur during that early part of the year. So if pastures are lacking rainfall during that April, May, and June time period, producers could look at that amount of rainfall and use the end of that time period as a trigger date to decide whether or not they should adjust stocking on those pastures. If moisture is short during that time period, then the land managers may need to adjust their stocking down for the remainder of the season to make sure that the amount of forage demand from the animals that they have out there isn't going to be greater than the amount of forage available to maintain the 50% residual at the end of the growing season. In the context of invading species and woody tree and brush encroachment, having pastures that are vigorous and have dense growth are going to be able to compete better for resources and crowd out those invading species. A dense grassland is going to provide shade and shade out those invading species. It's going to make it harder for invading species to compete for nutrients and for water uptake, and just overall going to provide more resistance to those invading and encroaching species. Although vigorous and dense pasture stands are not able to prevent invading species and woody tree and brush encroachment, they are able to provide more competition and provide more resistance to those invading species from getting into our pastures. In the end, grazing management really is a combination of art and science, and trying to find the balance between the amount of forage demand from grazing animals throughout the growing season and the amount of grazable forage that a pasture produces during that growing season, and achieving the goal that we have of optimal animal production while maintaining a dense and vigorous grassland, while at the same time achieving any wildlife habitat goals that we may have. We want to maintain those pastures with dense and vigorous stands so that they can perpetuate for years to come. Thanks for joining in. This is Keith Harmony from Kansas State University.